So when I saw Dan post on Twitter, does anyone want to speak? I've been wanting to, I've known Dan for a while now, as fellow SharePoint gurus, and thought it would be exciting to come back because I'm also quite removed from my own user group speaking. I want to start doing it more again. I really enjoy interacting with people and sharing what I'm learning day to day. And as I started thinking about, well, what did I want to do? Because I looked at all my old materials and they're a little old now. I don't think they would be as relevant to what the situation we're in today. And started thinking about the Power Platform. So when I came to AIS, which was in December of last year, I came hired as a modern workplace, specialist on the Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint end. That is my background. That is what I've done for a long time. It's where I feel the most comfortable. What ended up happening is I came in, the first project I got put on that I actually ended up managing, which is also a first for me, was a Power Platform engagement, where a big insurance company was moving thousands of InfoPath forms to Power Platform because they were moving from on-premises to SPO. And so being pulled into that process, I got exposed to a lot of the Power Platform in a way that I never had before. So I'm just going to tell you from the outset that, like I said, I am a SharePoint person. If you want to talk about SharePoint and the inner workings of information management policies, or the whatever nuances of a web part or content management or IA, or even development on the SharePoint end, I could talk about that deeply for days. That is where I have been the most comfortable for the longest time. But I thought I wanted to go into this area where I'm less comfortable. So I'm not coming to you as a Power Platform expert. Please understand I'm not trying to sell myself that way. Just some things that I have learned as I've been thrust into the Power Platform coming from my background, because some of you might be in that similar case where you've been a long-standing SharePoint person. For me, it's almost 13 years now. Back when we were, deploying solutions to the GAC and customizing every square pixel of SharePoint on-prem and doing all of that, waiting for our 3-year cycle for the new version to come up. That whole out world where I came from, and I know some of you are probably there as well, came from that as well. How do we interpret what's going on in the Power Platform in a rapidly evolving environment? I think the thing that makes SharePoint in particular exciting, and generally in Microsoft 365, is that there is a refinement on what the vision is for each of these applications inside of 365. So back in the day, SharePoint had to be everything for everyone. It had to be the main development platform. So we had to have super specialized developers that understand all the nuances of SharePoint and deployment methods for SharePoint and working in Visual Studio and all those things that were very specific to life as a SharePoint developer and SharePoint consultant. But over the years, Microsoft, particularly as they've moved from the classic world in SPO to modern SharePoint and bringing that back down to on-prem, there's a refinement on what SharePoint is as an application and saying this is what SharePoint does best. This is where we're going to focus on it. And so part of that were things like SharePoint Designer workflows associated with SharePoint Designer, and then InfoPath, right? So we see end of life for both of those things. The SharePoint 2010 workflows very recently announced end of life in a very abrupt end. So we're seeing a move away from that and saying, let's offset this to what the Power Platform can do because it does it better in a more cohesive way. So what have I learned coming from that old world, from the new one really as an outsider? So as I mentioned, I've been a SharePoint consultant working on intranet design, collaboration solutions, even back in the day when we did public websites on SharePoint. Some of you might remember that. Been doing that for a long time, been in the Microsoft space, really enjoy working with it, helping organizations implement different Microsoft technologies, and really love where Microsoft is going, both technologically and just messaging and procedurally about how they think about 365 and the story they're telling organizations today. So I work for Applied Information Sciences. They have a couple offices. Their headquarters are actually in Reston, Virginia. So before the pandemic, I was up there being onboarded. And I've worked generally for another company before I came to AIS that was in the Bethesda area. So very familiar with your area of the country, have been up there a lot. But AIS, really love working for them. At AIS, we've been doing cloud experience implementation for a long time now for lots of different industries. Our biggest business for the longest time has been Azure. where AIS built the majority of their company, but growing in areas today like the Power Platform and Microsoft 365 as well. So, so we do a lot of stuff there. So anything that would be of interest to you from advising, implementation, or managed services, we do all those different across Microsoft 365 and Azure. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through, I believe it's 6 different lessons. And even as I work through this, and I'm now in my second project that I'm doing right now on the Power Platform with the insurance company, as it has expanded, what are the things that I've learned? And this is gonna increase over time. This is the first thing that struck me about the Power Platform, is that the Power Platform is significantly harder to govern than SharePoint, as it exists today, I mean. So SharePoint, as I mentioned earlier, used to be a giant platform, had a lot of considerations for both implementation and governance when SharePoint was everything to everyone. Some of you remember, doing site and system master pages and doing all of those crazy deployments, setting up farms, all that. It still goes on a lot today. I've just been largely involved in SPO, but it used to be a monolithic platform that has thankfully become more focused over the years. And so SharePoint today is, I love that Microsoft is making SharePoint a great application for what it's supposed to be. And we're really seeing SharePoint, in my philosophy of what I'm interpreting this going along, is that SharePoint is really serving as a foundational piece for so many things that are happening inside of Microsoft 365, whether it's group-connected team sites for Microsoft Teams file collaboration, the experience that's mirrored in OneDrive for individual or small group-based document collaboration. And now Power Platform, we're going to talk about surfacing applications inside of SharePoint, using SharePoint as a data store, etc. So SharePoint is really being extended across the platform, and I think it's interesting how it's come and surfaced and found its way into the Power Platform. So now, as the Power Platform, considering it as a development platform, there are many considerations, like every development platform, that we need to consider and think about as your organization goes live. And as I came in as a manager of our project, working with solution architects and developers as they're coming in to roll it out, I saw that the insurance company that I was working with, I find that there are really 2 types of organizations in regards to how they think about the Power Platform. And at AIS, we're working with both of these types of clients. One is a client that wants to go in and enable the Power Platform for the organization. They haven't done so yet through licensing or some other means. So it's not turned on for them, but they want to explore it, and it's being pushed by InfoPath end of life, SharePoint Designer workflow end of life. Those 2 considerations are pushing them to think, how do we handle things like form management, business process automation, dashboarding, etc., or Dynamics type data stores inside of our organization in Microsoft 365. So it's being pushed that way. The second type of organization is one that had turned it on, but had little consideration into how they should govern it well. So a significant amount of sprawl has happened inside of the organization. We're working with another legal firm at AIS that has thousands of Canvas apps that were created, especially through the onset of COVID, and it's being enabled, that all of a sudden they have all these Canvas apps and they have no idea how to manage what is happening with them on their Power Platform adoption. They don't know how to receive insights to what's going on in the Power Platform, and it's turned into a very significant challenge for them. So those are the 2 types of organization I see based on where your organization might be at or where they're thinking about going. But regardless of where you're at, you still need to establish a baseline of how I'm going to not only govern this, configure the tenant, my environments, but also support the people that are going out and doing the development. Because I think what excites me the most about all Microsoft technologies in the enterprise is that they've always supported people going out who aren't necessarily in IT, but giving them the tools to put solutions together quicker that helps them work better. I mean, that's been the long history of SharePoint and InfoPath, for that matter, or SharePoint Designer. That someone doesn't necessarily need to be a full-fledged, full-time developer in order to build something. We see that with Microsoft Lists, right? The advent of that. Microsoft continues to want to enable people to they know they have other day jobs, but they have things they need to get done to bring them in a single environment to manage all of that. And so Power Platform provides that, and we'll talk about that on the lowest level in which you can accomplish some things inside of the Power Platform. But there are other things as well that you can become significantly more complex inside of the Power Platform. So you can open Canvas apps, connect to all kinds of different data stores that we'll talk about in a second, and create fully baked enterprise applications inside of this. So there's a wide scale in which we need to support how the Power Platform can be used inside of our organizations. I have a colleague of mine, his name is Andrew Welch. He's an MVP in business applications. And so he has put together, as a community-based effort, something called the Power Platform Adoption Framework. There's a link here. I'll share these slide deck. You can go and check it out as well. Basically an overview of how we think, particularly at AIS, how the Power Platform should be best adopted, rolled out, and supported. And it involves three main tracks. There's the design and build, how we actually build applications, how we plan for future workloads, how do we roadmap and think about what should the future look like in our Power Platform development. And the third, which I want to talk about today, I'm not going to talk as much about the other two, is enterprise management. So this is what I really love about the Power Platform Adoption Framework. Now, my goal of this session is to not be completely a governance conversation, but I want to talk about some details for you to consider based on this structure as you go and think about your own organization, how you want to support and bring in the Power Platform. And so the adoption framework has enterprise management broken into 5 main levels. And again, a lot of this will sound similar if you're developing or implementing another Microsoft enterprise technology, and I think about SharePoint specifically, but it really provides a great foundation for you to think about what are the different pieces I need to consider to make sure this is going to be properly governed. And so those cover 5 areas: platform management, enterprise architecture, ALM, security models, and user empowerment. And I think the 5th one is a really interesting part, user empowerment. We're going to talk about the COE starter kit, setting up a center of excellence in your organization that really has a unique level of maturity that is growing real quickly inside the Power Platform. And I'll be completely frank with you too. Up until probably 6 to 9 months ago, I thought of the Power Platform largely as, I don't want to say this pejoratively, but I thought it was basically a toy, because when I had originally done solutions with it as a consultant in the previous year and as it come out, we kept running into constraints that our developers would say we can't use what was then called Flow at the time or Power Apps because it has these limitations. So we ended up using a third-party tool like K2 or Nintex to solve those needs. And as I was forced back into the Power Platform, I realized that is not a case anymore. It is a very complex, but very feature-rich solution to build what you need, and where those gaps exist that don't meet your needs, extending it is a much better story than it used to be. So I just want to briefly talk about some of these different pieces as you consider in the context of the enterprise management framework. This will be the longest section of my presentation. The other 5 will be shorter, but just to talk about what I've learned. So the first in how to manage the platform is project tooling. So what are the different tools we use to manage platform work related to backlog management too? So in my particular my projects where we're moving to the Power Platform, we use Azure DevOps. I'm sure many of you are also using Azure DevOps as well. But what are the tools or other SDLC things that we need to bring in to help manage the execution and governance of a development platform, right? Not just SharePoint where we can stand up sites, turn them over. They can use it in a very rudimentary way as a content management system, but a full-fledged development platform. So all those ALM tooling considerations have to be there to help you think about how you want to manage that. One is road mapping. So how we actually interact with stakeholders inside of our organizations to prioritize solutions to be built. Because one thing that happens, as we've seen, these tools get rolled out, people get very excited about them, as we hope to, as we start to build a sense of urgency and excitement for the application we're rolling out. And so questions start coming in. How do we get prioritized? How do we do this? The organization I'm working with now is struggling to deal with how do we, as we enable the Power Platform inside of our organization, and all these people have questions, how do we possibly manage what is coming into us, and how do we work around that and help people and prioritize who should come into that? So that's an important consideration for your organization to think, is how that actually is going to happen. And Microsoft provides 2 tools to actually help and think about that. One is the Center of Excellence Starter Kit. I want to actually do a demo here and show you that if you're not familiar with the Center of Excellence Starter Kit. It was started as a community project. The owner now works at Microsoft, and it's being slowly over time being folded into the Power Platform. But basically, deploying and installing this is an important part of your Power Platform governance implementation, because it provides things like monitoring, alerting, controlling, and securing the Power Platform in the tenant that can't be provided otherwise by just stock tools provided inside the Power Platform admin view. So I want to actually show that to you in a second. But the other thing is establishing your center of excellence that exists inside of your organization. So in our particular, the company that I'm working with as well, we have gone out and with them, we've established who are the technical SMEs that are heading up their center of excellence, who are the people that are responsible for interfacing with these business stakeholders and helping write documentation, do training, do all those types of things that are pertinent to supporting the Power Platform in their organization. This is very similar to how we talked in the past and talked about building champions, training the trainer, that kind of approach what you would do with a tool like SharePoint, but now it's in this context of the center of excellence that has these reporting tools that are built into it. And actually, so I want to talk about the COE Starter Kit if you are not familiar with what it is, and just show briefly. It's a developer tenant, so it doesn't have as much data as it could have. I unfortunately can't show you a client COE Starter Kit installation, but just so you're familiar with its tool, and if it's not on your roadmap to install and help with your Power Platform implementation, that it becomes that quickly. So it's basically a collection of components, tools that are designed to help you get started in developing that strategy and monitoring the Power Platform inside your organization. So discovering who are the people that you should identify as your champions, and seeing what's being created, and all these different tools that are very important to make sure you have a handle on how your Power Platform is being adopted and utilized. So actually, I want to show this to you right now. I want to come over here, and I want to show you what the COE Starter Kit looks like inside of, when it's installed to your installed to your tenant, and how you can actually use and work with it. So I'm going to show you, I'm not going to show you everything that's involved in the COE Starter Kit, just some of the main pieces that I think are exciting and something that you should consider as you roll it out. So when you install the COE Starter Kit, and I have a link on my slides that can walk you through, there's a video that goes over its different components and documentation actually install its pieces. But you get several different functions that are going to be very important as you walk through it. So you'll get this app view, and there are a couple different pieces that are available to you to help you work through this. So one is, for example, I'm going to show you this model-driven app. We're going to talk more about model-driven apps in a second, that show you different components of how to manage different pieces. This is related to the admin view. So here you can see different apps that have been deployed to my specific environment. I'm going to walk you through a couple of them here in a second. All the apps that are listed, environments, connectors, and flows. And I actually want to show you a couple of these apps and the resulting Power BI dashboard that is made available to you. So here's an example for that. Until you install the COE Starter Kit, how you do this, you need this to be able to actually fill this particular gap and function side of the Power Platform. And two things that we saw a lot of that we work with were setting app permissions. So for example, in the organization that I'm working with, we go into consultants, we help develop these applications, we meet with these existing InfoPath form owners, gather requirements for them, understand how the form works, and we go through a development process on our end to bring that into the Power Platform. And along the way, we bring in those form owners. They can see how it was built technically, why we built it the way that we did, because ultimately the goal is to hand them off and not continue to be tied to that organization's IT department to make changes, right? So we also ran app in a day, automate in a day trainings, which I'll talk about here later on in our presentation. So they can then take on the management, the feature maintenance of their individual apps, which by the way, in that organization, they did not allow model-driven apps because of CDS reason, but they're primarily focused on Canvas apps. So one of those things that has to happen is that, like a developer on my team who is working, developed a particular app, but there would come a day where we needed to hand off that permission to go to a different form owner so they can continue to manage it. So this Canvas app inside of the COE Starter Kit allows me to search for a new user, the form owner that we were working with, and I can assign them a user role based on what I want them to have. Do I want them just to be able to view it, edit it? Most likely what we're doing is we're changing them to owners so they can then manage the permissions going forward. So this is an example of a Canvas app that in the COE Starter Kit that allows them to do that. Here's another example. Here are all the flows that exist in my my tenant, and you can see actually a lot of these flows, which by the way run regularly and pump data from their environment into CDS that's surfaced by the COE Starter Kit. So you can do a similar function that exists right as well. So I have a particular flow. I can associate an owner with it, and so they can make changes. A lesson learned real quickly is that so as we were working with this organization on moving their individual Canvas apps from a different environment in Power Apps, a test one, into their production one and enabling it for everyone to view, we learned before one of them, we had another developer on our team who was developing certain flows in Power Automate. And we forgot before she went on vacation for a week to go into the COE starter kit in this particular app and make them another developer and owner so they can actually deploy those flows. So again, that's an important workflow to go in to manage and make sure that you have available to you as you manage the Power Platform in your organization. And then finally, here is a Power BI dashboard that you get that comes alongside the Power Platform, and the COE Starter Kit. And there are three main ways. I'm not going to talk on length about each of them or how they work, but three main areas to consider as we think about what the Power Platform looks like, and that's monitoring. So the COE Starter Kit allows you to view your connections, your connectors, the flows and apps. So that's what we just looked at and talked through. How you govern it, so what are you actually archiving out there, and your license management. And then finally is nurture, so how you actually help makers go through the process, what they're using, how they're adopting the Power Platform. And you can see down here on this Power BI dashboard, there are a lot of different views that give you insights into how your environment is actually being used. And really, this is unique to the Power Platform. For those of you that work with SharePoint every day, which I would imagine probably is a lot of you, you probably have a frustration that I have working with SharePoint, and many of our customers do, that the reports and the analytics that are provided for you out of the box for SharePoint Online are minimal, to say the least. You can go into a certain site collection. You can now see hub site statistics, but they're only limited to a few charts. You can go into the tenant and administration and get a view that'll show you the different sites, who owns them, what kind of sites they are. But it's very rudimentary, whereas where you look at something like the Center of COE Starter Kit, there's a lot more data for us to be able to analyze and understand how it's being used inside of our organization. So again, this is a developer tenant, so it doesn't have a lot of data, so it's not super compelling as it looks because it's blank. But you can imagine as you go out and you start working in your organizations, creating different environments, which we'll talk about in a little bit, about how to move things from a development to a QA to a production environment, or maybe you want to have different environments based on your different business units, which is the common thing that we work with. What are the apps out there associated with each of those environments, and drilling into being able to see that. And I'm not going to go through this at length, but you can imagine as you're an administrator trying to manage what is going on in the adoption of the Power Platform, the tools here that are provided to you are really significant to see. What are the apps out there? What are the flows I have? How do I communicate with my makers or citizen developers, connections, and so on? So again, if this is something that you are not familiar with or have not used inside of your organization yet for your Power Platform adoption, I suggest that you consider it, because it's provided by Microsoft and supported by them. All right. So now that we've talked about the COE Starter Kit in brief, let's go back and let's talk. And we talked about platform management. Let's talk about the next section of the enterprise management for us to consider. That's enterprise architecture. So this is an area that is really, we found very important as we were going out, and as consultants, we were coming in, same with many organizations doing development internally. What are our different environments out there that we need to actually support? How are we authenticating to them? And license management. That's one thing too that caught me off guard coming from SharePoint. I mean, licensing inside of Microsoft 365 is already hard enough on its own to understand, but Power Platform has its own nuances related to which connectors you can use, what's premium, what's not, how it's related to other things like business premium, and what you get out of the platform is different than like an A3 and A5. So license management is an important part for you to discuss and be sure you get your head around going into the Power Platform, because even coming from SharePoint, which I allow people smarter than I to consider license management, helping clients with that, it was even harder to get my head around inside the Power Platform, and it's still not completely clear in my mind. So license management is a very important aspect of thinking through and making sure you understand how you're being used inside of the Power Platform. Reusable components is an important thing. So component libraries, which are a way for you, which is a relatively new addition to the Power Platform, allows you to build different component libraries that have individual pieces of them that can be used inside of apps and made available to your organization, so you can have consistent application and interaction design, UI layout for different pieces. That's an important part for you to consider. In fact, so on my project that I'm working on, we built component libraries into the project as we moved along. But another engagement that my organization is doing with another client, the legal firm I mentioned at the outset, they're starting with their templates and their component libraries going into it. So an important part of how you consider and make sure there's a consistent experience. I think a lot of us got burned going into InfoPath, enabling that, and we have seen some really bad InfoPath forms that cause a lot of confusion for people throughout our organization as they use it. So component libraries are an important consideration too as you think about your Power Platform usage. And then other data ecosystems and data sources you need to be aware of. Maybe you're connecting to Azure. For the company I'm working with, there are SQL on-prem connections that they need to be able to use that were connected to existing legacy InfoPath forms. How are you modernizing that, bringing that to the Power Platform, and how are you connecting to that data is important. So next is ALM. So ALM will be familiar to many of you that do developers, but again, its own ALM considerations related to Power Platform. Who will be developing the solutions? What are the standards that we have for them to apply? So component libraries are one means to that end. You know, how do we enforce for certain standards? But what components are used? And organizations also make different considerations on, do they want both Canvas and model-driven apps to be available? Do they want to steer people away from making customized list forms with Power Apps on SharePoint lists and libraries as well, which is a functionality we're going to talk about in a second. So how do we create and manage those standards and enforce them going forward, is because there's so many different levels of implementation choices that you can make inside the Power Platform. Of course, source control, how do we source and manage it, our solutions, and then our deployment pipeline. So for example, we're trying to set up Azure DevOps pipelines to manage some of our different pieces, and how you consider that as a development tool. Our penultimate part of the enterprise management model is security. So for example, security accreditation, what are the processes we're required to certifying it to use? How do we actually use it and navigate it? How do we secure Power Platform in our tenant? Because there are options available for us about what we lock down, how we lock down, who has specific access to it. How do we enable users to use the platform? So for the organization I'm working with, which is my most recent and significant experience with the Power Platform, we went through a process where we enable user management through the licenses were currently turned on for the 45,000+ people inside the organization, and they just finished the process of turning on the Power Platform component of the E3 license for all 45,000 people, and that's how user management occurred. And then of course, DLP is very important for any part of any any enterprise tool, certainly anything related to M365. How do we make sure that our data is not lost? How do we prevent that and implement across our different environments? And then the last one that we'll talk about before moving on to some additional lessons learned that I have are user empowerment. And this is really something that is not necessarily unique to the Power Platform, but has more of it because Microsoft loves to talk about, citizen developers and how do we cater to different people of varying technical levels, experiences, and nuance. So how do we support these people? And it might seem as an easy question from like a conceptually upfront, how you may use an internal tool to support them, but there's a lot of complexity that goes into how you manage them and how you help those different makers work. Through training, through different pieces that are provided to them. Do you use an internal tool to facilitate requests? Because a part of your center of excellence should certainly be onboarding people to the Power Platform and making them understand what's out there. But by far the biggest component is how do you continue to support them as the Power Platform grows in features and complexity and our own organizational needs that come up? How do we continue to support those people in it? And then are there specific groups that we're targeting for the platform? If you're starting to make the Power Platform more visible across your organization. Very common approach. We actually did this again on the current project that I'm on. We started with IT, with a very common way to start. And so we started with those users first. We discussed how to onboard them, bring them into the platform, and use what we learned from that process of training them, enabling them to then roll across to different business units. And that related to different environments inside the Power Platform. So IT has a specific environment that they enable their production level apps, as well as different business units inside the organization. And then, so citizen developers, as we turn this on, what are our expectations of what they should be able to do and what they can do? Because again, there's a lot that they can do. The organization I'm working with only has allowed Canvas apps because they initially didn't want to enable CDS due to licensing needs across the organization, or Project Oakdale, or whatever they end up calling it down the road. They didn't want that to be enabled. So that also cut off model-driven apps for us. So we could not use that as an option. The only option the organization currently has for app development is Canvas apps inside the Power Platform. And because the CDS isn't currently available inside their organization, the only thing they can use is SharePoint as a data store. So each organization has got a different tolerance about how they want to enable data reach and connection to different data sources, what they want to be available, and how the different components of the Power Platform they want to be. And that all relates to how we communicate to our citizen developers on what they can do. Because if anything I've learned of years being a Microsoft consultant, there's a lot of information out there, both from Microsoft, from MVPs and other people that are out there writing. They find out there are different features and things out there that they want to be able to use. How do we communicate to them how they can be used, if at all? And then finally, nurturing that community that continues to develop. How do we grow the Power Platform internally and continue to enable our organization? So I just wanted to go over that at a high level. What are the specific pieces of how you think about enterprise management and governance? Because I find it very helpful. And then overview is included in the adoption framework. And we do it a lot for our clients. And I think it's just helpful to see the complexity that exists for you and establishing those baseline governing rules as you go forward and use the Power Platform. Okay, so I'm going to turn next to my second lesson. So I know that was the longest one. The remaining 5 will be briefer. But I think this is one for me that might seem to many of you obvious, but for me was not as obvious. Because when I heard about the Power Platform, I naturally thought that, well, this is what InfoPath is supposed to be replaced by. And it is to a degree, but just because that is a way to accomplish what existed in InfoPath, like I said, I'm moving with a company thousands of these InfoPath forms into the Power Platform and retooling them as they go in. That does not mean it's the second version of InfoPath. In fact, it's a significantly upgraded tool to be able to use, as we would expect moving to Power Platform, and has its own complexity. So for those of you that worked with InfoPath, I tried to avoid it as much as possible back in the day. But for those of you who did, working with InfoPath was very tedious, a challenging tool to work with. And so it required different levels of complexity and skill to be able to work with InfoPath well. And there's definitely a reason why the usability of InfoPath alone, we can see why it was deprecated moving towards the Power Platform. It required a desktop install. In Power Platform, everything is done inside the browser. From the Power Apps Maker is all browser-based to this day. So that's another install. There's no separate install for that or SharePoint Designer that you have to use anymore. You all manage it and connect it inside of one place. There was no mobile support. Obviously, when InfoPath came out, the technology landscape that we had was different, but that is now all included in Power Platform, creating different views and catering to different devices, whether adaptive or through specific mobile views is available to us, in a much more powerful way to extend and utilize the platform. And UI customizations, like I said, they were difficult. Like the organization I'm working with has, I think, 11,000 InfoPath forms. I've looked at a lot of them, and a lot of them look exactly the same. And to a degree, that might be okay, what your organization want to be. It has a very InfoPath look, right, to it. So, but anytime you wanted to deviate that from whatever reason, you want a specific functional component or whatever it may be, or you want to embed something like my screenshot on the right that is from a Microsoft article that I've hyperlinked below. You can see inside this customized list form, when it was customized, they included a Power BI report alongside it. So this is something that we could never do in InfoPath, right? We could never go inside of the context inside of SharePoint, because there are going to be people inside of your organization that are comfortable with SharePoint, want to continue to use the list views that are provided inside of SharePoint, but want to change small things about them. And you can certainly do that inside of Power Apps, but you can also go significantly higher, but still all remain inside of the context of a SharePoint list or library, which is really great. And the last thing that I had to learn that is much better coming out of InfoPath into the Power Platform is that merging those groups of forms was next to impossible in InfoPath. So if you wanted to have related forms together, bring an enterprise application that cross different functions for a specific business unit, it was incredibly difficult. But the work my team is doing right now, they'll go in and they'll include 10 different InfoPath forms in one application that then gets reduced to 3 different forms inside of a Canvas app that are then merged together, have common navigation elements. It's significantly better than it used to be. So the link I have at the bottom for you to reference will take you to an article for Microsoft. For those of you that are coming out of InfoPath and want to know how does this relate and what are the things that are better, that's a good resource for you to start and to think about. The one thing that I had to learn too, going into the Power Platform, are what are the levels of customization that I can have on the Power Platform end and default SharePoint list forms themselves. This is actually an interesting area because back in the day when we were in classic SharePoint or previous versions of SharePoint as well, customizing those SharePoint list forms, you could do a little bit. You could add a web part to the top of them, but anything beyond that, you had to crack open InfoPath. You had to go and customize if you wanted to change how a specific dropdown works or a metadata field capture. And Microsoft has done a great job of providing another level that can meet a lot of business users' needs and don't need to go into the Power Platform even. So at the bottom level of complexity, if you go into, for those of you familiar, go into a SharePoint modern list or library, you can do CRUD operations based on data that exists there. But you can also edit the form right now. You can drag fields that exist inside of them. You can turn off specific metadata fields, and you never have to open Power Apps to do that right now. So that's the second level that I'm talking about here, is a customized SharePoint list form. So be sure that as you roll it out, your users know that if you want to do something simple like hiding a field or changing the order, that does not automatically mean you need to go into Power Apps to customize that and to make that the case. But there are going to be cases where you want to do more. You want to be able to do more than just highlight a field or reorder it or whatever that may be inside of a default SharePoint list form. And you want to do something like you want to remain inside of the context of SharePoint to do certain things, but you want to, for example, use an Office 365 connector or pull some data from a REST service, whatever it may be, or embed a report like we saw in the last screenshot. So that allows you, when you go into a SharePoint a list or library and you click the drop down to customize and you choose customize with Power Apps, that will then open the Power Apps Maker, allow you to make those changes and still stay inside of the context of a SharePoint list or library. The one thing that I have learned through some bumps and bruises of working with them, I talked a lot about the COE starter kit, and I showed you some Canvas apps in the starter kit that allow you to, for example, change the owner of an app inside of Power Apps. The one thing to keep in mind is that if your users are going out and they're customizing a lot of list forms in Power Apps, they are not automatically reported inside of the COE starter kit. You have to use PowerShell to report on where those actually exist. You can't change owners that exist on those individual things. So for example, if you have someone that goes out, customizes a SharePoint list form with Power Apps, and they leave the organization for whatever reason, reassigning ownership you can't do it, essentially. And we found that we actually customized a couple of these SharePoint list forms initially in the project, and we did them in a test environment, and there's no Microsoft supported route to move one of these customized SharePoint list forms from one list to another. So we had to, well, we still have bruises over it trying to make sure that process is healthy and moving from a dev environment to a production one. So those are just some considerations you think about enabling that functionality inside of your organization. You communicate to your users some of the pros and cons of using it. And then finally, at the top level are Canvas, but also model-driven apps based on what you've enabled inside of your organization. So this is where I want a completely custom UI. In modern SharePoint, there are web parts to be able to embed them in pages, etc. So that's the top level hierarchy. So just be considerate about where your customization needs exist on that, and you communicate what that hierarchy looks like. The one thing I've learned too is that, wow, back in the Power Platform has all these out-of-the-box data connectors, and you can extend them as you need. But I remember back in the business connectivity services days, for those of you who remember that, surfacing external data in SharePoint was a pain and caused me and my team much existential grief. So that whole process of surfacing that data and using it is so much better that exists in the Power Platform today. And Microsoft continues to expand what those different connectors are, those different gateways to interface with both Azure data, other cloud data, and also on-prem data as well. So really, you're really only limited by your imagination when you create your different applications out of Power Apps of what you want to surface and how you want to surface it. And so that was something that I learned that is significantly better. Even though my project has largely focused on Canvas apps that use SharePoint as the data store, we're about to work on a series of their application where they connected to SQL on-prem databases, and that was all done with InfoPath. And so we go out, we look at it, and just looking at those InfoPath form, you know how tenuous it was to establish that connection to SQL, to use it and surface inside of InfoPath. Now it's much better that exists inside the Power Platform. This is another thing to me that has jumped out about how we do training and continue to roll out adoption of the Power Platform in your organization. There are different ways to do training for a tool like SharePoint, for example, or Microsoft Teams or OneDrive, right? There are different ways to approach it on how you think about how you want to enable different people. So you can, for example, maybe you want to train everyone inside the organization, have a session with everyone, or you want to take a train the trainer approach where you choose specific people and they then go out and do it. There are different ways to do it. Also, the actual content of your training session. For example, I can have a training session and walk through the intranet that's being rolled out, how to use a SharePoint team site, and I can point and click myself, and I can do demonstration-based training, so they don't necessarily need to follow along with me. But that's not an option in the Power Platform. I can't open up the Power Apps Maker and just point and click my way through a lot of training and not have them follow along with me and do it. That training has to look different. It has to be focused on creation for them to understand, so it has to be lab-based. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a second about the tools that are provided from Microsoft to accomplish this in some different formats. So I'll come back to that in a second. But one thing we also learned too is that when you do these trainings inside of your organization, for those people that are comfortable with it, make sure you have multiple facilitators. Before, we had never done app in a day or automate a day trainings other than in person before. This is another thing to keep in mind in our COVID days while we're all doing things virtually. Make sure there are multiple facilitators and how you limit the number of people that come into those trainings so you can help them throughout the session. Because the app in a day, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and automate a day have multiple labs that they need to go out and work with. So make sure you think about the format in which to do that, and make sure you have enough people to support the teaching, coordination, and assisting participants as they work through the individual labs. And the last point before I talk through the different opportunities that are available to you, you might need to extend or customize the Microsoft provided materials to match your organization's usage of the Power Platform. So for example, I've mentioned that the organization I'm working with didn't allow CDS, and they didn't allow model-driven apps. So the current materials that exist for Microsoft are all centered around using those tools, and rightfully so. Most organizations do use those by default, but you might need to extend, make sure you're paying attention to what the materials that are going into and how it's matching your organization's use of it. If you have not been able to do an app in a day, there's a company, Pragmatic Works Training, that has a free virtual app in a day that links to all the materials that are currently out there for Microsoft, walks you through the training, gives you an onboarding. It's really great. I suggest if you want to start there and think about how you want to do in your organization to do that. So the two different options that are available to you, there are actually three. I'm going to talk about two in slides, but there's the app in a day training, which Microsoft provides, that allows you to talk about Canvas apps, CDS, model driven, and briefly talk about Power Automate, bringing those different pieces together. So that's available to you out in Microsoft. And then if you want to start rolling out Power BI, this is a really compelling one for dashboard in a day that walks you through an overview of how to use it, bringing your own data, build it. I'm very excited place to start. And the third is Automate in a Day. That's a community project that's currently being maintained. So you could, over these different training sessions, teach both dashboarding, app in a day, and automate in a day training, and to get everyone on board to how you want to use the Power Platform. So I'll try and wrap up with my last two and then open up for some final questions and thoughts as we come up to the end of our session. This is one thing that I learned, and this is actually the suggestion to me as the result of the architect that I was working with, because he came out of SharePoint 2 before he started becoming a full-time Power Platform architect, is that model-driven apps are a really great place to start, because SharePoint people are used to having a lot of out-of-the-box ways to view and work with data, and to customize them in a very simple way. Like I mentioned earlier, Microsoft provides tools to customize those list forms, much easier to accomplish small things. And for those of you that come out of SharePoint, me specifically, if I would have started with Canvas apps, even though I have a development experience in my background, it was overwhelming to me to start there and think about, it's great the flexibility that Canvas apps provides, but model-driven apps are a really great place to start because we're used to having default views and doing operations on lists, libraries, etc. And model-driven apps provide a lot of the necessary views to get done what you want to get done out of the box. And then as you progress over time and you decide, hey, I want more fine-grained control over the UI, how an app changes based on different devices and contexts, then you can move to Canvas apps. So if you're new to the Power Platform and you have an experience like me with SharePoint, model-driven apps are a good place to start and get your head around what's available to you inside the Power Platform. And I have a link here, Microsoft documentation, a good article to get an overview of what that model-driven app environment provides. At least in the app in a day, you talk about both of them, but it's another great place to start to get cemented in model-driven apps. And the training that I mentioned from Pragmatic Works Consulting, it actually is structured in such a way you can go forward and just start with model-driven apps and then come back to Canvas as you get more comfortable. All right, my last thing before I'll leave a little room for questions, if anyone has anything else they want to talk about before our session ends, is that I think I made the mistake that, I was a SharePoint consultant. How am I possibly going to get my head around how I need to use the Power Platform, until I stepped back and realized, interacting with the Power Platform, that the experience that I had gave me a unique head start on how to work with the platform. So there are several things that I've noticed as I go into the Power Platform that allow me to get an easier on-ramp to working with it. So I understood basics around form interaction and data entry through my work with lists and libraries for years on SharePoint. I had experience moving around component to achieve a visual presentation in a GUI format. So example, moving web parts around on pages and embedding them. And there's a reason why a lot of those embed tools are provided in modern SharePoint to surface parts of the Power Platform. I had experience working with alerting, with workflows through SharePoint Designer, and the basics of what process automation could and should look like inside of my implementation. You also most likely have experience working and defining with different types of data and the metadata experience that exists inside of SharePoint. And you can certainly come in that way at a low level inside the Power Platform, but it can quickly on-ramp. But you have the basics of understanding what these different data types are and how to interact with them in a data entry scenario. Most likely, if you worked with SharePoint, you have assisted your organization in managing the change, adoption, training, and all of that. And so once you get the specifics of how to accomplish those things inside of the Power Platform in your organization, you'll be good to move forward. And then you probably, if you've been doing it as long as I have, understand some of these past technologies and the technical legacy that exists coming into the Power Platform. So I've talked about SharePoint Designer and InfoPath, and you know where they've succeeded and what those failures were that led them to be moved on from Microsoft. And understanding now inside of our new landscape of Microsoft 365, which is really the core of where the benefits exist. I mean, you can't on-prem deploy the Power Platform, right? You have to have this dependency that exists in Microsoft 365. You understand how it's coming together and how Microsoft is positioning the different pieces together. So if you're like me, again, and this in your experience is not in this, know that based on all the things that we've talked about, most likely your on-ramp to the Power Platform is going to be quicker as you work through the different nuances of how to govern, manage, develop, and implement the Power Platform inside of your organization. So just a couple of things, my suggestions to you that I have done that have helped me. Do the app automate dashboard in a day. You can take one at a time and work through them. The app in a day is available. Like I mentioned, that's a great place. I would suggest that you start there, getting your head around what are the different technical pieces and implementation pieces that are available to you. And specifically, you need to understand the different implementation option. I think that's the core part of as you learn any new technology. What are the different types of apps I can build? Model-driven, Canvas apps, customized SharePoint list forms. What are the flow options in Power Automate that are available to me? The dashboards in Power BI. You can't expect to know all the great nuances of them, but at least at a high level understand what their specific use cases are for each of them. Leverage the tools that are provided by Microsoft to establish a center of excellence in your organization. And we've talked about some of those things, the enterprise management kit and how you govern it, but certainly the starter kit is a great place to start. And it doesn't take that long to install and to use and start monitoring your organization. And the last thing is that I just had to make a lot of mistakes. Still to this day, I misspeak on how I think things should operate. But through the help of other people that are more experienced than I, and community people and lots of resources, I've been able to make those mistakes and share what I've learned over time. So this is my first attempt to that end to share what I've learned along the way and how I would start if you're interested in venturing into the Power Platform as someone like me who comes out of different Microsoft technologies. So, all right, so Jay, I know we have 5 minutes left. I use the majority of that time, but if anyone has any final questions or comments, again, I'm not a Power Platform expert. If you have a specific question about how to implement something in a Canvas app, I'm not the person to ask. But anything that we've talked about here are lessons that I've learned. I'd be happy to take those.
Hey Chris, I have a question. I'm also like similar. I'm coming from similar background. Like almost last 15 years, I'm working on SharePoint development deployments, and recently we migrated to Office 365, and we are planning to explore the Power Platform. But as of now, we have like thousands of Nintex workflows and Nintex forms, right? Now, like the question is like how comparatively how easy it is to convert them. I mean, I cannot say convert like going forward. If you want to suggest the end users to go with Power Apps, how easy the developing, because we have lots of rules for hiding and disabling, and then also built-in JavaScript behind the Nintex forms to load some of the controls during the form load, a lot of cascading dropdowns, and a lot of validations, a lot, and workflows also very complex workflows, the state machine workflows, and customized task farms with Nintex. So can we achieve all these things with Power Platform?
Yes. So you're in a specific place with Nintex that you're better because you have a couple options, right? You can continue to migrate those Nintex forms, use them in Office 365. Nintex provides those tools. You could theoretically do that. You don't have to necessarily, you don't have to go first party and go to Power Platform necessarily. So that's the first option in front of you, right? And from a time management perspective, you can do that. As far as the development tools and complexity, from what I've seen and my understanding of Nintex in the past and the Power Platform today, there is a lot of overlap. And so a lot of that functionality that Nintex tried to address where there are gaps that existed in SharePoint Designer, existed in InfoPath, are remediated a lot in the Power Platform. Power Platform is still less mature than Nintex as a tool in terms of its years, but it's gaining very quickly. So I think what you're going to find as you evaluate the Power Platform, a lot of things you talk about, cascading dropdowns, a lot of those common development use cases are going to be covered very well inside the Power Platform. But in terms of its LOE and effort, I can tell you, even moving from InfoPath, which has significantly less complex things than you can do in Nintex, it is a significant effort to move and come over. The one thing I would advise you at this: consider your options based on its complexity. Perhaps you migrate them into Nintex Office 365 versions. You maintain them based on its current environment. A lot of that has to do with how you're working with SharePoint too, right? If you're coming from classic sites and you're going to modern sites, that's the most important thing, because you can't use a Power App in a classic site, right? So there's a SharePoint dependency that exists there as well. So perhaps you do a tiered migration where you move to support those Nintex workflows in SharePoint Online, perhaps in a classic, move to a modern environment, and then over time start to remediate the dependency on Nintex into the Power Platform. But so that would be my gut reaction of how to approach that, so you're not overwhelmed like the organization I'm working with. But I can tell you development-wise, feature parity, you're going to find it much more comfortable than, for example, trying to move something like Nintex or excuse me, from InfoPath. So that would be some of my main considerations that I would help you. The only you're going to have complexity, right? Managing two tools as you have different parallel streams and you overlap them. You have to govern Nintex as well as governing the Power Platform. But like I'm sure the organization you're in or working with is like the one I'm working with, where they want to reduce that third-party dependency. They want to come into first party and have that Power Platform integration. Just be aware of those different things that I've seen.
Yeah, but, that was the main question behind my question, because like we already migrated to SharePoint Office 365 with modern experience.
Good.
My thousands of sites to directly from on-premise classic to modern.
Good.
And we already migrated Nintex workflows and forms using ShareGate. Everything is like stabilized now.
Good.
Now the question arises like, we are investing on Nintex, at the same time we are investing with Office 365 E3 or G3 licenses, where our platform is part of that. So why we need additional investment on Nintex? Why can't we switch completely back to the Microsoft? That was the main question from higher authorities.
Good.
So that's we want to like. Maybe it cannot switch entire over a day. Like by going forward, we want to limit the usage of Nintex and more focus on the Power Platform.
Yes. I think that's wise. I think you're right, because it's already built into the licensing of it. Why would you continue to maintain multiple licenses, multiple different applications? I think the ideal end state, I don't know all the nuance of your organization, so I'm not going to say this is definitely canonically the way you should do it, but I think we're finding more and more that why would you do that? You want to move to first party as much as possible. I think that's the route forward, a good question to ask. And I think you're going to feel comfortable doing some of that development, obviously some nuances, some differences platform-wise, but coming into the Power Platform, you're going to have an even shorter on-ramp than I did. So I think you'll be good. I think you're going about the right way, structurally.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Chris, anything else you want to touch on?
I don't, no. So I hope that your journey to it is as successful as mine has been, and I look forward to several of you learning from what you've gone through in your own journeys to it, because it's been fun. I think the Power Platform is very, very exciting. We're seeing more and more opportunities arise in it. There's another thing to consider. If you're a consultant, you've been in SharePoint, I'm doing my own little career pivot because I'm noticing how much the investment Microsoft is doing in the Power Platform and how much clients are doing it. So ignore it at your own peril, I'll say that. And so I'm learning as much as possible to make sure that I understand it so I can continue to grow in it, because it is definitely for the foreseeable future where Microsoft's investment lie for automation and form management.
Yeah, definitely agree with you there. It's interesting to see the platform take off. So awesome. Well, appreciate you sharing your thoughts, your lessons you've learned. Definitely a pleasure to see you, so to speak. But if folks do have questions, would recommend hitting Chris up on Twitter, or if you want, you can tag the user group, and we're happy to take that and pull Chris into those conversations. But otherwise, really hope you guys have a terrific day. And Chris, again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see everybody else back in 2 weeks. So thanks so much, all.
Thank you.